a billionaire went to pick up his son from school and was surprised to see a black janitor with his son. "Get your hands off my son now!" Richard Hartwell's scream echoed across the courtyard of the prestigious Winchester Academy, causing several heads to turn. The billionaire real estate mogul charged like a raging bull toward the black man in a blue uniform, who was holding the hand of Tommy, his 8-year-old son. James Washington did not let go of the child's hand. Instead, he positioned himself discreetly between the boy and his hysterical father, his calm eyes contrasting with the storm brewing. "Mr. Hartwell, I can explain." "Explain what?" Richard spat out the words, his voice thick with venom. "Why is a janitor touching my son?" Security, security. At 42, James had seen this scene play out countless times. The same look of disgust, the same accusatory tone, the same automatic assumption that his presence near a rich, white child could only mean something sinister. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just another invisible worker being publicly humiliated. Tommy, confused and frightened, squeezed James's hand tighter. "Daddy, Mr. James was helping me." "I fell and shut up, Tommy," Richard growled, pulling his son away violently. "I don't want you near that person ever again." Other parents began to gather around, whispering among themselves and taking photos with their cell phones. Principal Campbell rushed over to them, her face red with embarrassment. "Mr. Hartwell, please let's settle this calmly." "Calmly?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I find a stranger with his hands on my son, and you want me to be calm? This man shouldn't even be in this school." James took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from a controlled anger that few men could keep in check. 20 years as a pediatric neurosurgeon before his fall had taught him to maintain his composure even in the most critical situations. "You're right, Mr. Hartwell," James said calmly, his polite voice surprising some of those present. "Perhaps I really shouldn't be here, but your son was bleeding from his forehead after a fall, and as a former doctor, I simply offered basic first aid." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard blinked slowly, processing the words "former doctor." But his arrogance spoke louder than his reason. "Former doctor," he laughed. "Sure, and I'm a former astronaut. Save your lives for impressing other suckers." The people around them began to murmur louder. Some parents looked uncomfortable with the scene, but no one dared confront Richard Hartwell. After all, he donated millions to the school every year. James looked around, memorizing every face, every expression of silent complicity in this public humiliation. But something in his gaze, a disturbing serenity, made some of those present feel an inexplicable chill. "I understand your reaction perfectly, Mr. Hartwell," James said, wiping his hands on his uniform. "After all, it's natural for a parent to worry when they see someone like me near their child. But know that our conversation is far from over." As he walked toward the cleaning supplies closet, James held his head high with a dignity that deeply disturbed Richard. There was something about this man that didn't fit the role of a submissive victim, and that irritated him more than any defensive reaction. There, in front of all the looks of contempt and pity, James Washington held a secret so explosive that it would turn this public humiliation into the greatest lesson in justice the Winchester elite had ever witnessed. If this story of prejudice and twists and turns touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple janitor is about to rewrite the rules of the game in a way that no arrogant billionaire will ever forget. News of the commotion at Winchester Academy spread through the local elites. WhatsApp groups like wildfire. Richard Hartwell wasted no time. Before he even got home, he had already called 3 members of the school board, demanding the immediate dismissal of the dangerous janitor. "Principal Campbell, I expect a convincing explanation of how you screen your employees," Richard growled into the phone. "Still in the school parking lot. My son could have been kidnapped by that suspicious individual." The next morning, James arrived at work to find a completely different atmosphere. The other employees' glances oscillated between pity and suspicion. Some colleagues who used to greet him now looked away, afraid of being associated with the problem. Supervisor Martinez was waiting for him in the storeroom, holding a clipboard with an air of formality. "James, we need to talk. We've received some concerns about your behavior with the students." "Concerns?" James asked calmly, his hands continuing to organize the cleaning supplies with surgical precision, a habit he had kept from his days in the operating room. "Several parents have called questioning whether it's appropriate for employees to have close contact with the children, she said, avoiding his gaze. Perhaps it would be best if you focused on administrative duties for the time being. James nodded silently. 23 years ago, he had lost his medical license after being falsely accused of negligence during surgery. The patient, the son of an influential politician, had died from complications that no doctor could have foreseen, but a black neurosurgeon from a humble background was a perfect scapegoat when the elite needed someone to blame. At the time, he had fought desperately to clear his name, spending all his savings on lawyers. He lost his home, his marriage, his reputation. That's when he learned a valuable lesson. Society didn't just punish crime. She punished those who dared to occupy spaces that didn't belong to them. But this time it would be different. This time he was no longer the naive young doctor who believed that competence and character were enough to overcome prejudice. Richard, meanwhile, savored his victory. Over lunch at the golf club, he told the story to his business friends, exaggerating the details more and more. Can you believe it? A janitor, probably an ex-con, with his hands on my son. Thank God I got there in time. You did the right thing, Richard agreed. Peterson, his business partner. Those types need to know their place. What Richard didn't know was that James had started his own investigation. During his nightly rounds at the school, he had noticed something interesting. Richard was often late picking up Tommy, leaving the boy waiting alone for up to 40 minutes. On several occasions, James had seen Tommy crying silently in the empty playground. Even more intriguing were the phone calls Richard took in front of the school. James, with his surgeon's trained ear, could pick up disturbing fragments. The fake documents are ready. The audit can't find out. If anyone talks, you know what to do. 3 days after the incident, James received a subpoena to testify at the police station. Richard had filed a police report alleging suspicious and inappropriate behavior with a minor. James's photo ended up in neighborhood groups accompanied by warnings about a predator on the loose in the area. At the police station, Chief Santos, clearly embarrassed by the situation, conducted a routine interrogation. Mr. Washington, you understand that we need to investigate any allegations involving children, don't you? Perfectly, officer, James replied with the same calm he displayed when explaining complex procedures to patients' families. In fact, I'd like to take this opportunity to inform you that I have some concerns of my own about the well-being of the child in question. The officer raised his eyebrows. What do you mean? James pulled a small notebook from his pocket, another medical habit he had never abandoned. Tommy Hartwell has shown consistent signs of emotional neglect and possible psychological abuse, anxiety attacks, social isolation, excessive fear of his father's reaction. The technical precision and medical vocabulary intrigued the deputy. This was not the typical profile of a janitor. Meanwhile, Richard celebrated at home, telling his wife, Victoria, how he had solved the school problem. That man will learn to mind his own business, he said, pouring himself a $500 scotch. Victoria, however, looked concerned. Richard, are you sure you're not overreacting? Tommy said the man just helped him. Tommy is a child, Victoria. He doesn't understand the dangers of the world. I'm protecting our son from a potential predator. What neither of them knew was that James had discreetly installed a recording app on his phone before each interaction at the school. 23 years of injustice had taught him that in a world where his word was worth less than his appearance, documented evidence was his only defense, and the recordings he had of Richard's conversations in the school parking lot would reveal much more than prejudiced behavior. They exposed crimes that could send the arrogant billionaire straight to jail. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside him that his oppressors couldn't see, a silent force fueled by the very injustice they sought to impose. What those privileged people didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing his own sentence of defeat, and James Washington was carefully documenting every word of that sentence. 2 weeks after the police report, James Washington was making his nightly rounds at the Winchester Academy when his phone vibrated. The message was from a number he hadn't seen in over 2 decades. Dr. Washington, this is Dr. Patricia Nias. I need to speak with you urgently. I saw the news. Patricia had been his resident when he was still operating at Central Hospital, one of the few people who had always believed in his innocence when he lost his medical license. Now she was one of the most respected pediatric neurosurgeons in the country and the medical director of one of the largest Hospitals on the West Coast. They met at a discreet cafe in the city center. Patricia, elegant in her dark blazer, could barely contain her indignation. James, when I saw your name in the local headlines as suspected of inappropriate behavior, I almost broke my phone in anger. This Richard Hartwell has no idea who he's messing with. Patty, you know how these things work, James replied calmly, stirring his coffee. The narrative has already been created. Former black doctor lost in life. Now a suspicious janitor. Not if you don't let it, she said firmly, sliding a folder across the table. I got copies of your original medical records, letters of recommendation from colleagues, testimonials from parents of patients you saved. Everything that was buried at the time. James opened the folder and his eyes filled with tears as he saw photos of children whose lives he had saved, handwritten letters from grateful families, scientific articles he had published in international journals, a lifetime of medical dedication that had been erased by a single unfounded accusation. There's more, Patricia continued. Remember Dr. Martinez, from the Ethics Committee, who acquitted you in the internal investigation. Before political pressure took over, he retired, but he kept all the documents. He's willing to testify about the irregularities in your case. Meanwhile, Richard Hartwell was basking in his success at a business meeting at the golf club. Can you believe that janitor had the audacity to question my authority in front of my son? He laughed to his fellow members. Well, now he's learning his place. What Richard didn't know was that James had begun his own investigation into the Hartwell family. Using his medical research skills and the surgical patience he had never lost, James uncovered disturbing information about Richard's financial empire. Through public records and connections Patricia had provided, James discovered that Richard's companies were involved in a complex network of tax, evasion, and money laundering. Even more shocking, Richard's son had been hospitalized 3 times in the last year for domestic accidents, a pattern any doctor would recognize as suspicious. During his night rounds, James had begun systematically documenting Richard's behavior at the school. With a small digital recorder hidden in his uniform, he recorded every phone call the billionaire made in the parking lot, every disrespectful comment directed at employees, every moment of neglect toward his own son. The recordings revealed a man completely different from the public image Richard cultivated. If those auditors find out about the Cayman Islands accounts, we're screwed, he whispered into the phone. And that lawyer at work who's investigating the factory conditions, she needs to be silenced before she causes any trouble. 3 days later, James received an unexpected visitor at his home. Tommy Hartwell stood at his door alone, his eyes red from crying. Mr. James, my dad says you're a bad person, but you've always been nice to me. He hurts me when he's angry. James's heart broke. His medical experience confirmed what he suspected. The marks on Tommy's arm, the fear in the child's eyes, the frequent accidents. Tommy, can you tell me what happens at home? The child revealed a terrible pattern of emotional and physical abuse. Richard beat him when he drank, locked him in his room for hours as punishment, and constantly humiliated him by telling him he was weak and useless. His mother, Victoria, knew everything, but was too terrified to act. James immediately called Patricia. I need you to examine a child discreetly. I suspect systematic domestic abuse. My God, James, are you sure? I have 23 years of experience in pediatric trauma. I know the signs. Meanwhile, Richard continued his smear campaign, spreading rumors about James in school groups and pressuring other parents to stay away from the dangerous janitor. He had even hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on James' past. What Richard didn't realize was that his arrogance was creating his own downfall. Every threat, every public humiliation, every act of prejudice was being meticulously documented by someone whose patience and precision had been forged in operating rooms where lives depended on every calculated move. Patricia had assembled a discreet team of professionals, child psychologists, civil rights lawyers, and even an investigative journalist who had covered corporate corruption cases. All volunteers united by their outrage at the injustice James was suffering. We have enough evidence to destroy Richard Hartwell on 3 different fronts, Patricia explained during a secret meeting: child abuse, financial crimes, and racial discrimination. The question is, how do we proceed? James looked out the window, watching the city lights. 23 years ago, he had been a naive young doctor who believed that the truth alone would be enough. This time, he wouldn't make the same mistake. We want more than justice, James said calmly. We want to make sure he can never hurt anyone again. At the Winchester Academy, Richard continued his arrogant routine, unaware that his every move was being watched and documented by someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to beat a corrupt system is to use its own rules against it. But the billionaire had no idea that this simple janitor was about to teach him a lesson about real power, the power of someone who has nothing left to lose but everything to prove. Winchester Academy had never seen a press conference like this before. 24 hours earlier, James Washington was just a janitor under investigation. Now he was sitting at an elegant table alongside Dr. Patricia, Nia's renowned investigative journalist Michael Torres, and a stack of documents that would make any prosecutor salivate. Richard Hartwell arrived at the school parking lot at exactly 9 in the morning, as usual, talking loudly on the phone about his minor problems with a troublesome employee. His arrogance evaporated the second he saw the television cameras and reporters gathered at the entrance. "Mr. Hartwell," shouted a reporter, "is it true that your company has evaded more than $15 million in taxes over the last 3 years?" Richard's face drained of color. He tried to retreat to his car, but other journalists had already surrounded him. Like sharks sensing blood, "Mr. Hartwell, how do you respond to the allegations of child abuse against your own son?" asked another reporter, shoving a microphone in his face. Inside the school, James watched through the window with the same surgical calm he displayed when operating on brain tumors. Patricia stood beside him, holding a folder containing the x-rays she had discreetly taken of Tommy, irrefutable, evidence of multiple fractures in various stages of healing. Phase 1 complete, James murmured. The world now knows who Richard Hartwell really is. But the true genius of the plan was just beginning. As Richard stammered out denials to the reporters, his phone rang. It was his accountant in a panic. "Richard, the IRS is here with a warrant. They have recordings of you talking about the Cayman Island accounts. How did they get that?" Richard felt his legs go weak. The recordings. Those conversations he had been sure were private in the school parking lot. Suddenly, a terrible memory surfaced. The janitor always cleaning nearby when he made his most compromising calls. That son of a Richard whispered. The realization hitting him like a punch in the stomach. Michael Torres, the investigative journalist Patricia had recruited, approached with a smug smile. "Mr. Hartwell, I have here a flash drive with 47 recordings of you discussing tax evasion, bribing auditors, and threatening witnesses. Would you like to comment?" James's strategy was devastatingly simple and absolutely legal. For months he had recorded Richard talking on the phone on public property, the school parking lot. As a former doctor, he knew the laws about privacy and evidence inside out. Every recording had been obtained within legal limits. "This is a setup!" Richard shouted, sweat pouring down his forehead. "You can't use those recordings." "Actually, we can," said the civil rights lawyer Patricia had brought with her calmly. "Conversations in public. Spaces have no expectation of privacy. And considering that his own words reveal crimes against the welfare of a child, it is our moral duty to expose them." At that moment, Victoria Hartwell arrived with Tommy. The child ran straight to James, completely ignoring his father, who was being publicly torn apart just feet away. "Mr. James," Tommy cried, hugging the legs of the man who had finally freed him from his domestic hell. Dr. Patricia said, "I don't have to be afraid anymore." The cameras captured everything. The child's natural trust in the suspicious janitor versus the visceral fear he showed in the presence of his own billionaire father. Victoria, with tears in her eyes, approached the reporters. I knew what was going on at home," she said, her voice trembling, "but I was too afraid to speak up. This man," she pointed to James, "saved my son, while my husband accused him of being dangerous. He was the only person who really cared about Tommy's well-being." The crowd of parents from the school, who just weeks earlier had whispered about the troublesome janitor, now watched in shock as the truth unfolded like a horror movie. Richard tried one last desperate gambit. "You believe the word of a janitor over mine? I built an empire. He's nothing but a Dr. James Washington." Patricia interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. "Pediatric neurosurgeon magna cum laude from Harvard Medical School, author of 17 scientific articles on childhood brain trauma. The man who saved the lives of over 200 children before, being falsely accused and losing his medical license due to political pressure. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard blinked repeatedly as if unable to process the information. 23 years ago, James said calmly, walking toward the cameras, I learned that society doesn't just punish crime. It punishes those who dare to occupy spaces that supposedly don't belong to them. Today I'm teaching a different lesson. True strength doesn't come from money or power, but from the patience of those who know how to wait for the right moment for justice to be served. At that moment, Richard's phone rang again. It was his partner, Peterson. In total despair, Richard, clients are canceling contracts. The board wants you to resign immediately. The stock is down 80%. Richard collapsed to the floor, literally. His legs could no longer support the weight of the total ruin that was collapsing on him. In less than 2 hours, he had lost his company, his family, his freedom, and any shred of dignity. James crouched down beside him, whispering low enough that only Richard could hear. Next time you judge someone by their appearance, remember that sometimes the janitor can be the smartest man in the room. As Richard was taken away in an ambulance, apparently he had suffered a panic attack and later in a police car. James remained in the schoolyard surrounded by cameras holding Tommy's hand. But the story was far from over, because while everyone witnessed the spectacular fall of an arrogant billionaire, one question hung in the air. What happens when a brilliant man, wronged by the system, finally decides to use all his knowledge and patience, not just to get revenge, but to completely transform the society that rejected him? 6 months later, Winchester Academy was a completely different place. The Hartwell scandal had become a national case, study taught in law schools, as a perfect example of how systematic prejudice could be legally dismantled by its own victims. James Washington was no longer pushing a cleaning cart through the hallways. He occupied the office that had once belonged to Principal Campbell, fired after the investigation, revealed that she had ignored multiple reports of Richard's abusive behavior. The new title on his door read, Dr. James Washington, Director of Child Protection and Academic Development. The irony was delicious. The man who had been deemed too dangerous to be around children now oversaw the well-being of all of them at the most prestigious school in town. Richard Hartwell, on the other hand, discovered that gravity really does exist. His company had gone completely bankrupt. Clients fled like rats from a sinking ship as soon as the recordings were released. His bank accounts were frozen by the IRS. His mansion was auctioned off to pay debts. Worst of all, he was serving a 5-year sentence for tax evasion, tax fraud, and child abuse. In federal prison, Richard discovered a bitter reality. Inside, it didn't matter how many zeros you had in your bank account. His arrogance and prejudice made him a perfect target for other inmates, who didn't tolerate men who abused children. Ironic, isn't it? Patricia remarked during a visit to James's new office. He spent his whole life judging people by the color of their skin and their social status. Now he's learning that in prison, those distinctions mean absolutely nothing. Tommy, finally free from domestic terror, blossomed like a plant that receives sunlight after years in the shade. Victoria had divorced Richard before the trial was even over, regaining her courage and independence. Mother and son now lived in a modest but peaceful home, something Richard's money had never been able to buy. Most touching of all was seeing Tommy running down the school hallways, shouting excitedly, "Dr. James! Dr. James!" Every time he saw his hero, the child who had once lived in terror now radiated confidence and joy. James had done more than avenge himself. He had transformed the entire culture of Winchester Academy. He implemented diversity programs, strict anti-discrimination protocols, and most importantly, created an environment where children from all backgrounds felt safe to report any kind of abuse. The reinstatement of his medical license had been just the beginning. Universities across the country invited James to speak on how to turn injustice into social change. Publishers fought for the rights to his autobiography. Hollywood producers wanted to turn his story into a movie. But perhaps the sweetest revenge came during the annual school board meeting. The same parents who had once whispered about the dangerous janitor now competed to greet Dr. Washington and take selfies with him. "It's amazing how quickly people change their minds," Patricia commented sarcastically, observing the blatant hypocrisy of the wealthy parents. James smiled with the serenity that had so bothered Richard on the first day. "They haven't changed their opinion of who I am. They've just discovered who I've always been. Linda. Holloway, the prejudiced socialite who had started the campaign against James, now avoided social events. Her own social circle rejected her, not on moral grounds, but because associating with her meant being on the wrong side of a story that had become a national symbol of justice. Winchester Academy became a model for other institutions. Delegations from private schools visited regularly to learn about the Washington Protocols, a set of guidelines James had developed to prevent discrimination and protect employees at all levels. One afternoon, while reviewing reports in his office, James received an unexpected letter. It was from Richard, written from prison on cheap paper in shaky handwriting. Dr. Washington, the letter began, and James noticed that Richard had finally used his correct title. I know I have no right to your forgiveness, but you need to know that I have learned who you really are. Not just a brilliant doctor, but a better man than I will ever be. My son is happy for the first time in his life, and that is thanks to you. Thank you for saving him from me. James folded the letter fully and tucked it into his desk drawer. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about understanding that some people have to lose everything to finally see the truth. Tommy appeared in the office doorway, as he did every afternoon after school. Dr. James, can I do my homework here today? Sure, champ, James replied, clearing a space on his desk. How was science class? Amazing, the teacher said. When I grow up, I can be a doctor, just like you. James watched the boy eagerly open his books. A child who had once lived in terror, now dreaming of the future. That transformation was worth more than any revenge. 6 months ago, Richard Hartwell thought he was humiliating a black janitor. In fact, he had awakened a sleeping giant. A man who not only knew his own worth, but had the patience and intelligence to prove it to the world. The lesson was crystal clear. Never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes that simple janitor can be the most powerful man in the room. And when someone tries to belittle you out of prejudice, remember the best revenge isn't to stoop to their level, but to rise so high that they have to break their neck just to see you. Richard tried to destroy James, but ended up destroying himself. James learned that true revenge is not to repay the harm done to you. It is to achieve the success that your enemies could never imagine. If this story of transformation and justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more. Stories that prove that in the end, the truth always wins. No matter how long it takes to come to 8. Thanks for watching. To Easy.